In the summer of 1838, workers digging behind an old chapel in coastal South Carolina found bones buried beneath melted iron shackles. They were not alone. The men swore the earth felt warm, as if something underneath had been waiting. The chapel had no name on record, no builder, no pastor. It stood behind a rotting plantation house that locals refused to speak about. Children were warned never to walk near it. Dogs would not cross the gate. The property once belonged to a woman known in letters only as Miss Evelyn Harrow. Wealthy, educated, unmarried, a quiet presence in town. But in faded church documents, there is a single strange note. Property cleansed after the incident. Records sealed by order of the diocese. No explanation. No incident listed. Yet from 1836 to 1838, 6 people vanished from the plantation. One of them was a young, enslaved man named Samuel. The story told for generations was simple. Samuel ran away north. Miss Harrow fell ill from heartbreak. The chapel was built for prayer and healing. That is the story the town chose to keep. But buried letters, found decades later inside a cracked wooden desk, tell something else. Something darker. They speak of secret meetings, of forbidden affection, of a church that would rather burn truth than let it breathe. They speak of a love that crossed chains, and of punishment that followed. By 1840, the plantation stood empty. The chapel doors were nailed shut. The diocese erased the Harrow name from records. But bones do not stay quiet forever, and neither does guilt. This is not a story about romance. It is a story about control, about a church afraid of scandal, about a town that chose silence over mercy, and about what happens when love is declared a crime. Evelyn Harrow was not like other women of her time. She read books her pastor disapproved of, philosophy, abolitionist essays, foreign sermons. She questioned scripture during Sunday gatherings. The townspeople called her strange. The church called her misguided. But she held power. The plantation was hers after her father's death. More than 100 acres. Dozens of enslaved workers. A symbol of old Southern wealth. Samuel arrived at the plantation in 1834. He was 19, born on another estate inland. Sold after his former master died in debt. Records describe him as quiet, literate, observant. That last word stands out. Literate. It was unusual. Dangerous. Samuel had been secretly taught to read by a previous owner's daughter. A kindness that would later mark him for suspicion. Evelyn discovered this by accident. One evening she found him reading a discarded newspaper near the kitchen door. Instead of punishing him, she asked what he thought about the article. That was the beginning. Conversations moved from newspapers to scripture. From scripture to law. From law to freedom. Evelyn began visiting the quarters more often. She dismissed overseers early. She insisted on teaching Sunday lessons herself. Whispers began. A white woman speaking alone with an enslaved man after dusk was not just frowned upon. It was forbidden. The church elders warned her gently at first. Miss Harrow, affection clouds judgment. But affection was not what frightened them. It was influence. If Samuel could read, think, and speak with reason, others might follow. And if the mistress believed in freedom, the entire order of the town could shake. By 1836, donations from the Harrow estate to the church quietly decreased. By 1837, Evelyn stopped attending services altogether. And in early 1838, she filed papers to free Samuel. The request never reached the courthouse, because someone intercepted it. Church records from March 1838 show an emergency meeting of the diocese elders. The minutes are short. Subject: moral disturbance at Harrow Estate. Matter to be contained. That same week, 3 riders were seen approaching the plantation after dark. No official report says who they were, but a letter written by Evelyn to a friend in Charleston paints a clear picture. They told me freeing him would disgrace the parish. They spoke as if God himself had signed ownership papers. They warned me that love, misplaced, becomes disease. The letter ends mid-sentence. It was never sent. Samuel disappeared 2 days later. The overseer claimed he ran. The church repeated the claim during Sunday sermon. The restless spirit of rebellion, the pastor said. But neighbors heard shouting that night. One woman testified decades later that she saw lanterns moving toward the chapel behind the main house. The chapel had just been built. Not for prayer, for containment. Local rumors said Samuel was held there for questioning. That the elders needed confession. Needed proof of manipulation. Proof that Evelyn had been tempted, not willing. Because if she chose him freely, then their whole structure of obedience collapsed. Witness accounts mention smoke rising before dawn. The following morning, ashes covered the chapel steps. And Samuel was gone. No runaway notice was ever posted. No search party organized. Evelyn locked herself inside the house for weeks. When she emerged, she looked thinner, hollow. She announced publicly that Samuel had betrayed her trust and fled north. Her voice did not tremble, but her eyes were said to be emptied. Within a month, she ordered the plantation closed. Workers were sold off quietly, and the chapel doors were sealed with iron nails. In 1892, long after the plantation fell to ruin, a carpenter hired to tear down part of the house discovered a hidden compartment inside the master bedroom wall. Inside was a journal, Evelyn's handwriting. The final entries were written in uneven strokes. I believed kindness could live inside cruelty and change it. I was wrong. She wrote that Samuel had not run. He had been taken. She was summoned to the chapel by church elders. They demanded she sign a statement claiming Samuel seduced her for status. She refused. They told her freedom papers would infect the county. She described hearing Samuel's voice through the chapel walls. Not screaming, reciting scripture. The journal claims he was forced to confess to planning revolt. No evidence supports this, but fear did not require proof. Evelyn wrote that she threatened to expose the church publicly, to travel north and tell newspapers everything. That threat sealed his fate. They told me God requires sacrifice, she wrote. On the final page, ink smeared across the paper. They said the fire would cleanse the scandal. She never described seeing his body, but she described the smell. Burned wood, burned cloth, and something else. The carpenter who found the journal delivered it to local authorities. Within a week, the journal vanished from records. The official report claimed it was damaged beyond reading. But the carpenter's grandson later swore he read it fully before it disappeared. And he remembered one line clearly. They buried what they feared beneath holy ground. When construction crews uncovered bones in 1911 while preparing the land for resale, the chapel foundation had already crumbled. Underneath layers of brick and soot, they found iron shackles fused by heat. The remains were incomplete. Fragments of ribs, a charred femur, teeth cracked by extreme temperature. The town doctor examined them briefly and declared the bones too old to matter. They were reburied without ceremony. No forensic study, no inquiry. By then, the church had built a larger cathedral in town. The old diocese members were long dead. The story of Samuel had faded into rumor. But children playing near the site reported strange things. They heard reciting at night, soft voices repeating verses. Workers complained of sudden headaches when digging too deep. One man refused to continue after claiming he saw burn marks shaped like handprints on the soil. By 1920, the property changed owners 3 times. Each family left within a year. Illness, financial ruin, one unexplained suicide. Locals whispered that Evelyn had cursed the land. But no one considered another possibility. That Samuel was never meant to disappear quietly. That the chapel was not just a place of punishment, but a warning, a message carved into ash. Love, when it threatens power, must be destroyed. And yet, it survives in whispers, in sealed letters, in bones that rise back into light. This was not simply a forbidden affair. It was a system protecting itself. And systems do not forgive. They erase. But sometimes, the ground refuses to cooperate. By 1874, the old chapel was gone. In its place, the town built something grander. St. Bartholomew Diocese. The cathedral rose in stone and stained glass, tall enough to cast a shadow across half the town square by late afternoon. People said it was a symbol of renewal. But foundations matter. And some foundations are laid over silence. Several original elders from the Harrow years contributed large donations to the new cathedral's construction fund. Their names are carved into marble plaques inside the entry hall. Not one plaque mentions the Harrow estate. Not one record references Samuel. The town archives between 1838 and 1842 contain unusual gaps. Baptism records continue. Marriage certificates continue. But disciplinary minutes are missing. Torn out. A historian reviewing the archive in 1931 described pages removed with surgical precision. When questioned, the diocese secretary simply replied, "Water damage." But the paper around those sections showed no stain, only absence. The cathedral became a place of moral instruction. Sermons against rebellion. Sermons about divine order. Sermons warning women about emotional weakness. The message was consistent. Structure must remain. Authority must not be questioned. Love must obey hierarchy. For decades, townspeople sat beneath colored glass depictions of saints who suffered for faith, never realizing that beneath their feet lay a story of someone who suffered for choosing love across a forbidden line. Every institution needs a sacrifice story. They just rarely admit when they create one. Evelyn Harrow did not live long after 1838. Official cause of death, fever. Unofficial accounts describe something different. Isolation. She moved into one wing of the plantation house and sealed the others. Servants were dismissed. Windows boarded. One neighbor recalled seeing her walking at night toward the ruined chapel foundation, barefoot, carrying a lantern. She stopped attending church entirely, which, in that era, was not simply spiritual rebellion. It was social exile. In 1840, she wrote one final letter to a distant cousin in Massachusetts. That letter survived because it never passed through local hands. I tried to free him, she wrote, not only from bondage, but from the belief that he was meant to carry it. She admitted she underestimated the cost. They did not fear scandal. They feared example. Those words matter. Because example spreads. A free Samuel would not just be one liberated man. He would be proof. Proof that chains could be broken legally. Proof that a woman with power could reject the rules handed to her. Proof that the church did not control every conscience. That was the true threat. Evelyn's letter ends with a confession that chills even now. They told me he confessed to rebellion. I heard no rebellion in his voice. Only prayer. 3 weeks after sending that letter, she died. No autopsy. No investigation. The estate transferred to distant relatives who never visited. And just like that, a chapter closed. But grief has weight, and sometimes it presses downward into the soil. By 1902, the plantation land was mostly overgrown. The house partially collapsed. The chapel foundation barely visible beneath vines. It became a place for dares. Children snuck through broken gates to prove bravery. Several reported the same experience. Soft singing. Not hymns from the cathedral. Different. Low. Slow. Rhythmic. Like someone reciting scripture alone in the dark. Parents dismissed it as imagination. But one incident changed the tone. A 12-year-old boy named Thomas Wilkes wandered onto the property in 1909 and did not return by nightfall. Search parties combed the area with lanterns. They found him near the old chapel foundation at dawn. Alive, curled on the ground, repeating a phrase over and over. They buried him where the prayers burned. He could not explain what he meant. He claimed he followed a voice. When asked what the voice said, he answered calmly. It said the truth was locked under stone. Thomas never spoke normally again. He developed episodes of panic whenever church bells rang. Doctors called it trauma from getting lost. But he was not lost. He was exactly where the voice led him. The land was fenced off after that. Not because of ghosts. Because rumors were becoming inconvenient. And inconvenient stories threaten stability. Especially when they echo what institutions worked hard to silence. In 1931, a young historian named Clara Whitfield arrived in town researching church architecture. She intended to document the growth of Southern dioceses after the Civil War. She did not intend to uncover anything buried. While reviewing the cathedral archives, she noticed the missing pages from the late 1830s. She asked questions politely at first. Who was Evelyn Harrow? Why did the plantation close suddenly? Why were there no runaway notices filed for Samuel? The archivist grew uncomfortable. Clara expanded her research to county land records. She found references to dispute resolution meetings held at the chapel in early 1838. But no details. Then she located the carpenter's grandson, the man who remembered reading Evelyn's journal before it vanished. He repeated the line clearly. They buried what they feared beneath holy ground. Clara requested permission to examine the old chapel site. Permission was denied. She wrote to newspapers in Charleston asking if they had archived any abolitionist controversy linked to the Harrow estate. 2 weeks later, her boarding house room was searched. Nothing stolen. Only her notes rearranged. A warning. She left town shortly after, but not before mailing copies of her findings to colleagues. Those copies were never acknowledged publicly. Because institutions do not crumble from noise. They crumble from documentation. And someone ensured hers would not be published. By 1947, The cathedral began minor renovations. Workers reported discovering old iron fragments mixed into the soil beneath the rear courtyard, fragments shaped like chain links. When the foreman suggested notifying authorities for historical review, he was told it would delay construction unnecessarily. The fragments disappeared. No record logged. But one laborer kept a single piece. He described it later as warped by heat, as if it had survived a fire. By mid-century, the story of Evelyn and Samuel existed only in whispers passed between families who dared to question old sermons. The official narrative remained unchanged. A misguided mistress, a runaway slave, a closed chapter. But bones had surfaced once. Iron had resurfaced twice. And questions kept resurfacing across generations. Because some stories refuse burial, they wait. They surface through children's voices, through hidden journals, through gaps in official books. What happened at the chapel was not an accident. It was correction, a correction enforced by fear, a reminder to the town that power defines morality, and morality can be rewritten. But rewriting leaves marks, burn marks. And if you look closely at the stone foundation behind the cathedral, you will still see faint black stains that never fully washed away. Fire purifies, they said, but sometimes it only preserves what it tries to destroy. By the early 1800s, sermons in the American South often sounded calm on the surface. Order, obedience, divine structure. But underneath those gentle words was something harder. In the archived sermon notes attributed to leaders of St. Bartholomew Diocese, one phrase appears again and again. Authority is mercy. That phrase shaped everything. Authority is mercy. It sounds comforting, protective, but it also means this: questioning authority becomes sin. When Evelyn asked to free Samuel, she wasn't just challenging property law. She was challenging a spiritual hierarchy the church believed it guarded. In private meetings, elders reportedly argued that if enslaved men could be seen as equals in intellect or morality, then the theological foundation supporting slavery would fracture. And if that foundation fractured, so would their power. Samuel's literacy frightened them more than affection ever could. A literate man could interpret scripture. A literate man could argue. A literate man could inspire others. Control depends on limits. Who can speak? Who can read? Who can decide? The chapel behind the Harrow House was not just a room. It was a courtroom without public record. A place where confessions were extracted to preserve order. They did not see themselves as villains. They believed they were guardians. Guardians of tradition. Guardians of social stability. Guardians against chaos. That is how cruelty survives. It convinces itself it is necessary. According to fragments of oral history recorded decades later, Samuel was pressured to sign a written confession. The accusation: conspiracy, not romantic involvement, not inappropriate contact. Conspiracy. That word changes everything. If he was simply loved by Evelyn, the scandal was personal. If he was planning revolt, the threat became public. Public fear justifies extreme response. It is easier to burn a rebel than a man who prayed quietly in a locked chapel. Witness accounts suggest he refused to confess at first. One elderly descendant of a plantation worker claimed her grandmother heard Samuel say, "I will not lie to protect their fear." We cannot confirm those words. But we know this. No signed confession has ever surfaced. If one existed, it was destroyed. The narrative shifted quickly after his disappearance. Sermons warned of influenced minds. Sermons spoke of women misled by manipulative tongues. Evelyn was portrayed as weak, deceived. Samuel was painted as cunning, ambitious. The town accepted that version because it restored balance. It allowed people to believe the system was still intact. That night in 1838 was not just about punishment. It was about rewriting the story before it could spread. If Samuel had lived as a freed man, walking openly beside Evelyn, the town would have witnessed something impossible in their worldview. Equality. That possibility had to be erased before it took shape. Fire erases quickly. Ash leaves little detail. But erasure always leaves doubt. And doubt waits quietly for someone brave enough to look closer. After Samuel's disappearance, Evelyn publicly withdrew. But silence does not always mean submission. Several financial records show she began selling portions of land quietly months before her death. Why? One theory suggests she intended to fund legal action outside the county. Another suggests she was preparing to leave entirely. But she never left. A farmhand later claimed he overheard a confrontation between Evelyn and a church elder shortly before she died. She allegedly told him, "You burned him to keep your throne." That sentence, if true, reveals something important. Evelyn did not believe Samuel died as punishment for revolt. She believed he died as an example. Examples discourage repetition, and repetition spreads movements. If one plantation mistress freed a man publicly and defended her decision, others might question their own obedience. The church's authority depended on moral certainty. Certainty depends on stories that never crack. Evelyn was a crack. Samuel was a mirror. And mirrors can show people what they do not want to see. After her death, rumors spread that she was cursed. But curses often begin as warnings ignored. The land did not become restless because of ghosts. It became restless because truth was buried without acknowledgement. And buried truth shifts over time. Communities survive by agreement. Agreement on what happened. Agreement on what did not. By the early 1900s, older residents still remembered whispers about the Harrow estate. But younger generations were taught a simplified version. A misguided woman. A runaway slave. An unfortunate scandal best left in the past. Forgetting is powerful. It smooths edges. It allows children to play without fear. It allows sermons to continue uninterrupted. But forgetting requires maintenance. When Clara Whitfield began asking questions in 1931, she threatened that maintenance. She did not accuse. She simply documented inconsistencies, gaps in records, unexplained fires, financial shifts. She traced donations from the Harrow estate directly into the early construction funds of the cathedral, which suggests something chilling. The same wealth tied to the scandal helped build the institution that silenced it. Stone paid for with silence. Windows funded by erasure. When Clara left town abruptly, the message was clear. Some archives are not meant to be opened. Some foundations are not meant to be examined. But even sealed archives decay. Ink fades. Paper weakens. And eventually, someone always returns with fresh eyes. Forgetting works only until memory resurfaces in another form. Through children. Through workers. Through buried iron. In 1949, during a late evening service, a small tremor shook the town. Not an earthquake large enough to cause damage, but enough to rattle stained glass inside the cathedral. Several attendees claimed they heard a cracking sound beneath the rear courtyard. The next morning, a section of stone had shifted slightly, just enough to reveal darker soil beneath. Construction crews were called to stabilize the foundation. During repairs, one worker uncovered a pocket of charred earth mixed with iron fragments. More than before, someone quietly instructed the crew to fill the space immediately. No further digging. One laborer later said he felt sudden heat rising from the soil. That may have been imagination, or memory embedded in place. But the timing is strange. Because that same year, national conversations about segregation and civil rights were beginning to grow louder. Ideas once buried were resurfacing across the country. Freedom papers, denied in 1838, were being demanded publicly more than a century later. History has a pattern. What is suppressed returns. Sometimes gently, sometimes violently. The tremor in 1949 was small, but symbolically it mattered. The ground shifted, just slightly, as if reminding the town that foundations built over fear never settle completely. And beneath that cathedral, beneath the polished stone and careful sermons, something still waited to be fully uncovered. In 1963, a young schoolteacher named Daniel Harrow returned to the town after serving in the military. He carried a family name people still recognized, but rarely spoke aloud. Harrow. Daniel had grown up hearing fragments. A distant aunt who lost her mind. A plantation scandal. A runaway slave. But his grandmother told the story differently on her deathbed. They burned the truth, she whispered. Not just the man. That sentence stayed with him. Daniel began reading local archives. He visited the courthouse. He examined land transfer documents. He found Evelyn's signature on early drafts of emancipation paperwork, papers that had never been finalized. He also found something strange. A financial ledger entry from 1839 transferring Harrow estate funds directly to St. Bartholomew Diocese labeled as restoration contribution. Restoration of what? The chapel had burned. The estate had closed. Restoration implied repair. Repair implied damage. Daniel started asking questions publicly. That was new. Clara Whitfield had asked quietly. Daniel asked during town meetings. He suggested the church open sealed archives. He proposed an official historical marker at the old chapel site. The response was calm but firm. There is no verified wrongdoing, the diocese stated. But Daniel was not searching for legal guilt. He was searching for acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is often more frightening than accusation, because it cannot be dismissed as rumor. It demands ownership. In 1965, during routine renovation of a secondary storage building behind the cathedral, a locked trunk was discovered. Inside were loose documents from the late 1830s. Not complete, but enough. Among them, a partial transcript from an emergency diocesan meeting dated March 1838. One line stood out. Action must be decisive to prevent contagion. Contagion, not rebellion. Contagion suggests spread. Spread of ideas. Spread of example. Spread of equality. There was also a torn page referencing disciplinary fire authorized. The rest of that page was missing. But context matters. When Daniel requested to view the documents officially, access was restricted within days. The explanation, preservation concerns. However, before they were sealed again, a local journalist photographed several pages. The images circulated privately, not published widely, but shared among families who had long suspected the official story was incomplete. The language in those pages revealed fear, not of violence, but of change. The elders wrote about maintaining divine hierarchy and protecting the spiritual health of parishioners. They framed their actions as protective, necessary, even righteous. That is how institutions justify harm. They redefine harm as duty. Daniel understood something crucial at that moment. The story was no longer about a tragic romance. It was about institutional survival. And institutions, when threatened, will sacrifice individuals to preserve structure. As conversations spread through town, something unexpected happened. Descendants of the original church elders began speaking privately with Daniel. One elderly man confessed that his great-grandfather had been present at the 1838 meeting. Family letters described a regrettable but essential purification. Purification, another word heavy with implication. These descendants were not defending the past. They were struggling with it. Because inherited stories shape identity. And discovering that your ancestors protected injustice creates fracture. Some wanted the truth acknowledged publicly. Others feared that reopening history would divide the town. Division was already there. It had simply been managed through silence. Daniel organized a small gathering near the old chapel foundation. Not a protest, a reading. He read from Evelyn's surviving letters. He read from the partial diocesan transcript. And then he spoke Samuel's name. For the first time publicly in over a century. There was no dramatic reaction. No thunder. No supernatural event. Just quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not silence imposed. Silence absorbing truth. And that shift mattered. Because once something is named, it cannot fully return to shadow. In 1972, after years of pressure and debate, the town council approved a modest historical marker at the former chapel site. The language was carefully negotiated. It did not accuse. It did not condemn. It stated, on this ground stood a chapel built in 1838 following a local dispute involving questions of freedom and faith. The full history remains under study. Under study. Even then, caution remained. At the dedication ceremony, Daniel spoke briefly. He did not describe fire. He did not describe bones. He said only, truth does not destroy faith. It tests it. The cathedral still stood. Services continued. But something subtle shifted. Sunday sermons no longer emphasized hierarchy as aggressively. Language softened. There were new discussions about justice, about equality, about confronting difficult pasts. Acknowledgement did not undo what happened in 1838. It did not return Samuel's life, but it ended the official denial. And sometimes that is where healing begins, not in rewriting history, but in finally allowing it to be read. Today, the land where the chapel once stood is quiet. Grass grows evenly. The foundation stones are barely visible beneath soil and time. But if you stand there at dusk, when shadows stretch long across the field, you can still feel something heavy in the air. Not haunting, not rage. Weight. The weight of a story once buried deliberately. The weight of a system that chose preservation over compassion. The weight of a woman who tried to challenge it. And a young man who refused to confess to a lie. St. Bartholomew Diocese still exists in name. The leadership has changed many times. The cathedral still holds services. Children still play in the town square. Life moved forward. But history never truly disappears. It waits in archives, in letters hidden behind walls, in iron fragments warped by heat. The story of Evelyn Harrow and Samuel was never meant to surface. It was meant to warn others into obedience. Instead, it became something else. A reminder that institutions built on fear must eventually confront what they buried. And that love, declared dangerous, labeled contagious, burned in secret, can outlive the fire meant to destroy it. This has been the Forgotten Files. And some files close quietly, but some remain open, beneath the stone.